We hear a lot of big claims when it comes to new technology, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it's about something as fundamental as our food.
Oh, definitely.
And you think about genetically modified foods. Often you hear this promise, feeding a growing world, totally safe.
It's a narrative that's, well, it's been very widely promoted. Sometimes it feels like it's presented as if the science is just completely settled, case closed.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah.
Because this deep dive, it's taking us into a very specific viewpoint. We're looking at source material, mostly excerpts from a book called Seeds of Deception.
Mm-hmm.
And this book, it takes a really distinctly critical look at GM foods, the industry, the whole regulatory side of things.
Right. So our job today really is to be your guides through this particular set of sources. We're going to explore the claims, the specific evidence presented here about the science, the rules, the marketing, and yeah, some pretty surprising stories the book tells.
And it's super important, I think, to say right up front, this material itself presents a critical view, a very critical view. It makes specific allegations about safety, about transparency, about influence.
Yeah.
Our role here is just to understand and convey those specific claims and examples from the source material. We're letting the source speak for itself, not taking sides in the wider debate.
Exactly. The source material we're digging into today, it makes some pretty bold claims. It suggests, and this is a quote, that industry influence, not sound science, has allowed these foods onto the market.
Wow.
Yeah, and it claims the evidence it presents suggests the food should, quote, never have been approved. It really doesn't hold back. It states pretty bluntly that it believes lies, distortion, and deception are commonplace tools to market GM foods.
Okay.
So that's the perspective we're examining today, purely based on what's in this book, these excerpts.
So the source kind of starts by setting the stage, laying out its core argument.
Right.
It basically calls the whole genetic engineering craze in food a catastrophic diversion.
Right. The book argues the real problem with hunger isn't actually scarcity. It says there's enough food. The issue is poverty, how food is distributed.
And it alleges that big companies, it specifically names Monsanto, deliberately push this myth of scarcity. Why? To sell their products.
Mm-hmm.
The source even includes a quote they attribute to Monsanto saying something like, there really isn't much difference between foods made by Mother Nature and those made by man. What's artificial is the line drawn between them.
So this perspective, it frames the whole thing not as some big scientific leap for humankind, but more as a market-driven thing, allegedly pushed through because of influence, not solid science.
Yeah.
The book really hammers this point that the scientific research, in its view, suggests these foods shouldn't have been approved, not in the first place.
And it talks about deliberate efforts, lies, distortion, deception in the marketing. So that's the lens, that's the viewpoint this source is coming from.
Which brings us to how the source questions the science itself. It argues fundamentally that genetic engineering is just different from traditional breeding.
Okay, how does it describe that difference then?
Well, the source says, traditional breeding works within natural boundaries. You select traits from plants or animals that can actually breed together. Genetic engineering, as they describe it here, crosses those natural barriers. You're sticking genes from totally different species, maybe bacteria, viruses, even into a plant's DNA.
And the source quotes a Nobel laureate, George Wald, on this.
Yeah, it includes his warning. He said genetic engineering creates essentially new organisms, self-perpetuating and hence permanent. Once created, they cannot be recalled. He saw it as like irreversible tampering with evolution, basically.
That's a heavy thought. So the source then gets really specific about what it claims can go wrong when you insert genes this way. It lists like a whole bunch of potential problems.
It calls it what could go wrong, a partial list. So one thing is what it calls code scramblers.
Code scrambler.
Yeah, it explains that spliceosomes, these are natural things in our cells that process genetic instructions. They might get confused by the inserted gene or maybe rearrange the genetic code around it, and that could change the protein that actually gets made.
So it's not just the new gene itself, but how the plant's own machinery might react to it. That's the idea.
Exactly. And it mentions hitchhikers, too. These are molecules like phosphates or sugars that can apparently glom onto the new protein and change its effect.
Oh.
The book quotes a Professor David Schubert, who highlights that these kinds of unpredicted changes, well, in the source's view, they haven't really gotten much attention.
Okay. What else does the source point to?
It talks about gene silencing or instability, meaning the inserted gene might just become unstable over time so the new trait disappears. Or maybe worse, it could trigger the silencing of the plant's native genes.
Right.
leading to unpredictable changes, potentially harmful ones that the source claims just aren't well studied.
And there's something called insertion mutation. What's that?
Yeah, the source points out that the very act of sticking the foreign gene in can mess up the host's existing DNA sequence.
Okay.
It draws a parallel to problems seen in human gene therapy, where this kind of thing has been linked to leukemia. The suggestion is it could create toxins or other issues in plants, though it does note this hasn't been studied closely in plants, according to the source anyway.
So the process could be the risk, not just the gene itself.
That's the concern raised here, yeah.
Yeah.
It also mentions position effects, like where the new gene actually lands in the DNA strand can drastically change how it works, maybe disrupt nearby native genes. And things like gene guns, they can apparently sometimes cause rearranged codes during the whole insertion process.
And if you combine multiple foreign genes, that makes things riskier.
That's the argument the source makes about gene stacking. It uses Monsanto's new leaf potato as an example engineered with 8 foreign genes. The idea is the more you stack in, the more chances there are for unpredictable interactions.
The source even says unexpected bits of DNA can just show up.
Yes, it gives the example of an extra piece of DNA found in Roundup-ready soybeans. The book quotes Monsanto admitting this extra bit would have been in the soybeans used for safety tests.
Right.
And the source kind of asks, well, what kind of safety assessment would even detect something like that?
There's also a concern raised about antibiotic-resistant marker genes, isn't there?
Right. The source talks about these genes like one used in sprout corn. It argues they could potentially transfer resistance to bacteria in our gut, which could contribute to the bigger problem of antibiotic resistance. It notes that organizations like the WHO and the American Medical Association have apparently called for these marker genes to be phased out.
And then there's a promoter gene, something that keeps the new gene constantly on.
Yeah, the CAM-V promoter, it's described as controversial. The source says it could potentially activate dormant viruses or maybe even create new ones if it transfers horizontally to other organisms. A possibility, it claims, has been shown in lab research.
Okay, so the takeaway here reading this source is that genetic engineering isn't just adding one simple, predictable trait. It's presented as this complex process that could lead to a whole cascade of unintended, possibly harmful effects. Effects the source claims haven't really been studied properly.
Exactly. The source quotes a team of scientists who summed it up by saying, controversies and knowledge gaps appear to be present at all levels when it comes to the science of GM crops.
And based on all that, the source concludes.
It quotes Schubert again, saying, given our current lack of understanding, GM food is not a safe option. And it adds from Barry Commoner that none of the essential tests are being performed, which is like a central argument of the book.
That view definitely pushes back hard against the idea of settled science.
Yep.
So, okay, given these alleged scientific unknowns, the source then presents these specific case files, things it claims highlight early problems or maybe findings that got buried.
The first big one is the story of Arpad Pusztai. The source paints him as this highly respected, really thorough scientist. He was actually commissioned by the UK government to develop standard safety tests for GM foods.
But the source says he was pretty shocked by what he found when he looked at the biotech company's submissions. For GM, soy, corn, tomatoes, stuff already being secretly approved in the UK back in '96.
Yeah, the source claims he found data missing, studies that were poorly designed, just really superficial tests in those submissions.
In his own research on rats-fed GM potatoes.
That's where, according to the source, things got really interesting. His team engineered potatoes with something called a lectin gene. The study apparently found significant nutritional differences, like one line of GM potatoes had 20% less protein than the non-GM parent potato.
Okay, but the really striking finding, as the source tells it, was actual damage to organs and immune systems in the rats.
Yes, and crucially, this damage allegedly happened even with GM potatoes where the lectin gene wasn't actually expressing properly.
Oh, wow.
Which suggested to Pusztai that the problems might be coming from the genetic engineering process itself, not just the new protein being made.
And his worry was this could mean problems for humans already eating GM food.
Especially kids, the source says, because their organs and immune systems are still developing rapidly. The source goes into detail about the fallout when Pusztai's findings were mentioned ahead of a TV interview. It claims his director, Professor Philip James, who was initially supportive, suddenly suppressed him, like switched his phone line, intercepted his faxes.
The source describes these intense attacks on Pusztai's work, his credibility, claiming accusations of fabrication, shoddy research, even though there was apparently evidence refuting that.
And the audit panel James set up, the source claims it was made up of non-nutritionists. They weren't given all the data. They supposedly reviewed his huge body of work in less than a day, and they didn't even talk to Pustai himself. Their report, which found deficiencies, was apparently kept secret. Only 10 copies printed, the source says.
And the source points out how the U.S. press, in its view, mostly just dismissed European concerns as, like, unscientific fear-mongering. It claims the Pustai incident was named one of the 10 most underreported events of the year in the U.S. by Project Censored.
So the alleged insight from this case, reading the source, is that these early warning signs, even from credible scientists, weren't just dismissed but maybe actively suppressed. And the whole thing was largely missed or ignored by the U.S. media.
Another case file the source brings up is the Flavsaver tomato study. That was the first GM crop approved in the U.S., right?
That's right. The company, Calgene, apparently voluntarily sent feeding study data to the FDA, which the source notes later companies didn't always do.
But the source points to internal FDA documents that suggest there were concerns.
Yeah, according to these documents cited in the book, FDA scientists were worried because 7 out of 40 rats fed the GM tomatoes developed stomach lesions. None in the control group had them.
Stomach lesions. And there were unexpected deaths, too.
The source notes that, 7 of those 40 GM-fed rats apparently died unexpectedly within just 2 weeks. And the company's study allegedly didn't provide an explanation for why.
So what did the FDA scientists say, according to those documents?
The source says they asked for more data. They wanted to resolve these outstanding safety questions, stating that the data they had fell short of a demonstration of safety.
Okay, so the alleged pattern the source wants us to see here, from these early examples, is that safety questions were being raised, even in the limited testing that was done. But these concerns were somehow bypassed or downplayed when it came to actually approving the foods.
Moving on a bit, the source includes these sort of anecdotal observations from farmers, stories about animals apparently avoiding GM crops.
Right, like the Iowa farmer whose squirrels reportedly just wouldn't touch the GM corn he left out for them in winter, even when their natural food ran out.
Yeah, or the Minnesota family with captive elk. They said the elk would eat organic corn and soy readily, but apparently never went into the GM fields right next door.
There's a writer quoted, Steve Sprinkle. He observed deer eating organic soybeans but not the Roundup Ready kind, and raccoons eating organic corn but not blot corn.
And there's a story about a farmer in Holland who put out 2 piles of corn in his barn for the mice, 1 GM, 1 natural. The source claims the mice only ate the natural pile, left the GM stuff completely alone.
So the source presents these not as, like, scientific proof, but more as simple, real-world observations. Hints, maybe, that animals' natural instincts might guide them away from something potentially harmful?
Next up, the source tries to connect some human health crises to its concerns, and it draws parallels about how hard it can be to trace problems back to a source.
It tells the story of Betty Hofkamp and others who suddenly got incredibly sick with this debilitating, sometimes fatal illness, eosinophilia myalgia syndrome, EMS, back in 1989.
Yeah, this was a really mysterious illness. Awful symptoms, severe muscle pain, spasms, weakness, rash, fatigue, and these incredibly high counts of eosinophils, a type of white blood cell. Doctors eventually traced it back to the L-tryptophan supplement.
And the source zeroes in on Showa Denko, the Japanese company linked to that specific outbreak.
Yes, and specifically on the fact that they used genetically engineered bacteria to boost their L-tryptophan production yield. The source argues that these GE bacteria could produce higher levels of toxic byproducts. Unknowns.
It quotes Professor Charles Yanofsky on this, saying, anytime you overproduce a small molecule in bacteria, there are unknowns of this type.
Exactly. So the source's argument is that only Showa Denko's L-tryptophan caused the epidemic, and that as they kept modifying their GE bacterial strains, they produced more contaminants, which explains why the number of cases went up over time.
And the FDA's response, according to the source, how did they handle it?
The source claims the FDA initially tried to downplay any link to the genetic engineering aspect. It quotes one FDA official who apparently blasted a doctor for, quote, propagating hysteria.
And the source goes even further, alleging a potential cover-up.
It does. Based on investigations by others that are referenced in the book, the source makes a pretty serious claim that the FDA and the CDC might have known that the GE strains played a crucial role in the EMS outbreak and allegedly kept that information quiet to protect the growing U.S. biotech industry.
The result was L-tryptophan got pulled from the market. But the source then draws this critical parallel for GM foods.
Yeah, it argues that EMS was distinct enough, weird enough, that doctors could trace it back to one source. But it asks, what if it had been a common illness, or something with delayed effects, like cancer showing up 20 or 30 years later? The link might never have been made.
Right.
So the core point the source is making is, because GM foods in the U.S. aren't labeled, if similar health problems cropped up, tracing them back to a specific GM food would be incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, for both consumers and researchers.
Another major case file the source discusses is RBGH, recombinant bovine growth hormone.
Right, this is a GE hormone they inject into cows to make them produce more milk. The source lays out the controversies around its alleged negative impacts on the cows themselves, claiming things like more udder infections, needing more antibiotics, metabolic stress, even wasted carcasses.
And it details controversy during the review process in Canada, at Health Canada.
Yeah, it alleges that scientists at Health Canada found flaws in Monsanto studies, found data was omitted, but then felt pressured to approve the drug anyway, and it claims they faced threats and retaliation if they raised concerns.
What about potential links to human health? What does the source raise there?
The source highlights that RBGH can increase levels of another hormone, IGF-1, in cows, and it notes that IGF-1 in humans is linked to various cancers, breast, prostate, colon, citing several studies.
And the source claims the FDA knew that IGF-1 could survive digestion.
Yes, and alleges this information was basically hidden. It references a request from the Center for Food Safety to actually withdraw RBGH based partly on this concern.
The source also includes examples of alleged media pressure related to OPGH.
It tells the story of two Fox TV investigative journalists, Jane Aker and Steve Wilson. They allege they were pressured by Fox management, who were reportedly linked to Monsanto through advertising revenue, to basically falsify their story about RBGH dangers.
Falsify it.
According to the source, their story was rewritten 83 times to be more favorable to Monsanto before they were eventually fired because they refused to air the altered version.
Wow. And the LA Times, too.
The source mentions that Monsanto representatives allegedly visited the LA Times to discourage them from using Dr. Samuel Epstein, who was critical of RBGH and cancer links, as a source after he wrote a critical op-ed.
And Monsanto withholding data.
The source claims Monsanto dropped data from some rat feeding studies where organ weights increased in the rats, and then allegedly claimed in court that this data was a trade secret to stop it from being disclosed.
So the picture this source is painting with all these case studies is one of alleged potential harm showing up in tests and in the real world, combined with alleged pressure and suppression to stop these concerns from getting out or affecting approvals.
Which leads us to the source material's critique of the U.S. regulatory system itself. It's highly critical.
One of its most striking claims is that there are basically no required pre-market safety tests for GM foods in the U.S.
Yeah, it calls the regulations so lax. A really big point of criticism for the source is this idea of substantial equivalence.
Right.
This was the initial approach, where GM foods were just sort of presumed to be equivalent to traditional foods, so they didn't need as much testing.
And the source argues that lacked a scientific basis.
Completely, and claims it was criticized by FDA's own scientists. The source notes that while the FDA later stopped using that specific term, substantial equivalence, for GM foods, it allegedly kept the same policy. No requirement for rigorous long-term safety testing.
This is where it gets really interesting,
Nice.
because the source includes claims from scientists inside the FDA.
It does. It presents claims from people like Louis Pribble, Suzanne Worthley, Carl Johnson, Alexander Apostolou, drawing on internal memos, affidavits, government reports, like one from the GAO. They allegedly stated that warnings about risks were literally deleted from policy draft.
Deleted.
Yeah, that sound scientific procedures were ignored, and that they faced pressure to reach conclusions that were, favorable to the industry.
Pribble is quoted in the source calling one policy draft a political document that just reads very pro-industry.
And the source connects this to alleged political influence. It mentions President George Bush Sr. asking for less regulation, an FDA commissioner's memo linking policy to White House goals, even President Clinton apparently praising Monsanto by name in a State of the Union address.
The source also highlights what it calls a revolving door, people moving between government agencies and the biotech or food industry.
Right. It points to examples like Michael Taylor, who held positions at the FDA and also worked for Monsanto, referencing alleged deletion of warnings from policy drafts while he was at the FDA. Lester Crawford, Suzanne Setchen are others cited with similar alleged industry ties and regulatory roles. The source claims these conflicts of interest even extended to having industry reps on advisory panels.
What about testing for allergies?
The source critiques the methods, use things like resistance to digestion, molecular size, comparing structures. It argues these methods are unreliable, scientifically unsound, based on inadequate standards. It uses the FDA's approach to testing starling corn as an example of these alleged flaws.
And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency.
The source claims the EPA also didn't demand key data or change its methods, even when studies supposedly suggested problems with bite crops, like studies allegedly showing the bite toxin lasting longer in digestion than assumed, or mouse studies showing immune responses, or studies on farm workers exposed to bite.
So the overall picture of regulation presented in this source is one where, in its view, the system was compromised, undermined by political pressure, industry influence, leading to safety standards being weakened or just ignored, and internal scientific concerns getting steamrolled.
Moving beyond the regulators, the source alleges there's been an active campaign to shape public opinion. It claims an intensive pro-biotech campaign targeted the media, which resulted in a chronic underreporting of GM concerns, especially health risks.
And the source gives specific examples of scientists and journalists it claims were targeted because they raised concerns.
Yes, it names people we've mentioned, like Arpad Pusztai, the Fox TV journalists Aker and Wilson, Dr. Samuel Epstein, Linda Welmer, Dr. Shiv Chopra, examples of people who allegedly faced pressure or suppression or attacks on their credibility.
It also claims there were broader efforts to suppress information and dissent.
Yeah, the source mentions something called the Royal Society's alleged Guidance for Editors plan. The idea, according to the source, was to steer journalists toward using scientists who were deemed credible, which the source implies meant scientists approved by the pro-biotech establishment.
And here's where it gets into some really modern tactics, online stuff.
Right. The source details the alleged use of fake online identities, Mary Murphy and Andura Smeticek. It claims these were created by a PR firm, the Bivings Group, working for Monsanto.
Fake identities.
Apparently, purportedly used to attack a scientist named Ignacio Chapela and his research on GM corn contamination in Mexico, attacking him on an online listserv for scientists, AgBioWorld. The source claims this triggered a campaign to get his paper retracted by the journal Nature. It references journalist George Monbiot's investigation that allegedly uncovered these fake identities and linked them back to the PR firm.
There's even a story about a whole magazine issue being pulled.
Yes. The source tells the story of The Ecologist magazine. It claims its printer pulped an entire issue that was critical of Monsanto, allegedly after being contacted by the company. The source adds that the printer later admitted Monsanto refused to guarantee they wouldn't sue the printer if they printed it.
And the source also focuses on industry efforts to fight labeling initiatives.
Using Oregon's Measure 27 as an example, the source claims the anti-labeling campaign spent $5.4 million. That's 25 times what the proponents spent. It alleges they used wildly inflated cost estimates, like claiming labeling would add $550 a year to a family's food bill. And their brochure apparently featured a letter from the FDA Deputy Commissioner Lester Crawford opposing the measure.
What about the tactics used to kind of control the narrative generally?
The source mentions dismissing critics as, Luddites, anti-technology activists, or just plain loony. It also points to how golden rice was heavily promoted as this positive poster child for GM tech. While the source argues serious questions about its actual effectiveness or safety were downplayed, it references an article called The Great Yellow Hype.
So the key point this section makes, according to the source, is that there's been this sophisticated, really well-funded campaign to manage public perception of GM foods, allegedly involving suppressing critical info and targeting dissenters.
Moving on, the source gives several examples it claims show contamination and spread in the environment, how hard it is to contain these things.
The starling corn incident is one it revisits. That was the corn approved only for animal feed, but it ended up in human food because shipments got mixed.
Right. The source highlights the huge recall costs estimated at $1 billion. And it notes the admission that because of cross-pollination, Starlink would basically be in the food supply forever.
Wow. Another example is Protogene corn back in 2002.
Yes. This was corn engineered to produce a pig vaccine. It contaminated a soybean shipment. Required destroying the soybeans, cost about $2.8 million. The source also mentions an earlier incident where pollen from corn-producing pharmaceuticals might have contaminated a nearby field in Iowa.
And the contamination in Mexico. with traditional corn varieties.
This is presented as a really major case. The source details findings where GM DNA was detected in traditional native corn varieties in Mexico, which is the center of origin for corn, its birthplace.
Right.
It quotes the executive secretary of Mexico's Biodiversity Commission, describing finding GM DNA in up to 95% of the plots they tested in some areas, calling it the world's worst case of contamination.
So the overall point from these examples, as the source presents it, is that containing genetically engineered organisms, once they're out there in the environment, is incredibly difficult, maybe practically impossible.
Okay, so what does all this mean for you, the listener, when you're, pushing your cart down the grocery aisle?
The source material really highlights a major challenge. In the US and Canada, GM foods are mostly not labeled, so it's very hard to even know if you're eating them.
The source lists some common places and says they're prevalent.
Yeah, major crops like soy, corn, cotton, canola, Hawaiian papaya, some zucchini and yellow squash, these are listed as very likely sources. The source even estimates the percentage of U.S. crops that are GM for many of these. High percentages.
It also includes dairy products.
Yes, specifically milk and dairy from cows injected with that RBGH hormone we talked about,
Yeah.
and also meat, eggs, and other dairy that comes from animals fed GM feed, which is most conventional feed.
And even ingredients you might not really think about.
Definitely. Food additives, enzymes, flavorings, processing agents. It mentions examples like aspartame, the artificial sweetener, and rennet used in cheese making, says these are often products of genetic engineering now.
Vegetable oils and margarines made from soy, corn, canola, or cottonseed are also likely GM unless they specifically say otherwise. Even honey and bee pollen might contain traces from GM plants the bees visited, according to the book.
Does the source offer tips for avoiding them? Though it sounds challenging.
It does suggest looking for certified organic labels or specific non-GMO labels, but it adds a caution that non-GMO standards can vary quite a bit. Certified organic is stricter. It prohibits GM ingredients, processing agents, and milk from RBGH-treated cows. It also suggests asking restaurants and just trying to understand common ingredients derived from those major GM crops.
Yeah, this really drives home the source's point. Without mandatory labeling, trying to make an informed choice based on the kinds of concerns raised in this material is, well, it's incredibly difficult for the average person.
Finally, the source includes this really interesting section. It explores a connection it sees between food and behavior.
It introduces the story of Barbara Reed Stitt and Fairfax High School.
Yes. According to the story told in the book, they completely changed the school's diet, got rid of the processed foods, the junk food, brought in fresh whole foods, and the claim is it led to this huge shift in student behavior.
How so?
Claims of dramatic drops in kids carrying weapons, dropouts, expulsions, drug use for years, plus improved grades, a much calmer school environment. A revolution, the source calls it.
And there's some related animal experiments mentioned, too.
Yeah, the source includes stories like one where Stitt's own mice apparently started killing and eating each other when they were fed junk food.
Oh, my gosh.
And another story about second graders observing mice becoming lazy and antisocial after just a few days on a junk food diet.
A UK study on little kids, 3-year-olds.
Yes, the source mentions the study. It reportedly showed that artificial colors and the preservative sodium benzoate, even at levels below the legal limits, led to increased hyperactivity and distress in these young children, according to both their parents and independent observers.
Now, the source doesn't directly link this to GM foods, right? So what's the point it's trying to make by including these examples?
Right, no direct GM link is made there. The point seems to be illustrative. The source uses these examples to suggest that food can have really profound, sometimes unexpected effects on our behavior, our mental state, effects that might not be immediately obvious or easy to trace back.
Okay.
And then it argues that the psychological effects of GM foods are, in its view, similarly unfounded. But it means unfounded in the sense of not being studied or understood, not unfounded as unproven, non-existent.
Gotcha. So it's presented as another potential area of impact that the source claims just hasn't been properly looked at when it comes to GM foods.
Exactly. It serves as kind of a final example in the book of areas it believes are just being overlooked.
Okay, so let's just recap what we've walked through today, remembering this is all strictly based on this specific source material we've been discussing. We've explored a perspective that really fundamentally challenges the safety claims around GM foods. It argues the technology itself is inherently unpredictable, introduces potential risks that aren't there with traditional breeding.
We've looked at the source's claims about regulation and testing being inadequate. including these allegations of internal scientific dissent being ignored, policies being shaped more by, well, alleged political and industry pressure than by independent science.
And we've covered the source's perspective on efforts to control information, allegedly targeting critics, suppressing data, actively working to defeat things like labeling initiatives.
Yeah, the source material makes a really strong case that all these factors, especially combined with the lack of labeling in the US and Canada, make it incredibly challenging for consumers like you to even know if you're eating GM ingredients, let alone make an informed choice based on the kinds of serious concerns raised in this book.
So here's maybe a final provocative thought for you to mull over, building directly on the claims presented in this source material. If, and it's a big if based on these allegations, if the approval and the widespread rollout of these powerful new food technologies was indeed driven more by political will and industry lobbying than by rigorous, independent, transparent science, and if the potential long-term effects on health, maybe even behavior of the environment, are still largely unknown and untested, as this source forcefully claims, what does that truly imply about our current food system, about our fundamental ability as individuals to make genuinely informed decisions about what we put into our bodies for our own well-being and maybe for the health of the planet too?
It's a pretty significant question, one that the source certainly pushes you to think about and maybe explore further.
Absolutely. We really encourage you to seek out information from a variety of sources. Keep doing your own deep dives into this incredibly complex and, well, really important topic.